Next on Newsmax Now.
I'll accept that we will get hit for this.
White House Speaker Paul Ryan says inaction over the health care bill was not an option. Plus, the new CBO score on the bill is just out. We'll give you the very latest details.
It's a recommendation by the president, but the actual decisions are made by Congress.
Senator Mitch McConnell reacts to President Trump's controversial budget proposal and why he's still not sure if he has the votes to pass the GOP's health care bill in the Senate. And President Trump meets with Pope Francis at the Vatican for the first time, where the president seemed touched by their conversation. All that and more as Newsmax Now starts right now. And welcome to Newsmax Now. I'm your host, Miranda Kahn. As always, thanks for joining us. We have a lot to talk about on this Wednesday, so let's go right to it. Let's bring in our panel. Joining me now on the National Anchor Desk, we have Dr. Christopher Metzler. He's a conservative strategist. And joining us from Newsmax DC, we have Grover Norquist. He's the founder and president of Americans for Tax Reform. Grover is also the author of the book In the IRS Before It Ends Us. Thank you both for joining us today. Pleasure to have you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Let's talk about our big story today. We've been waiting all day. We've been on pins and needles for that Congressional Budget Office to release its scoring for the latest edition of the American Health Care Act. We dropped that just moments ago, and we're going to share that with you. We'll also talk about why Senator Mitch McConnell says Obamacare must go, no matter what this report says. All right, let's look at what else is on our agenda today. We're also going to be taking a look at reaction over President Trump's $4 trillion budget deal. Education Secretary Betsy DeVos suffering just the wrath of angry Democrats on Capitol Hill today. And we'll talk about President Trump's meeting with Pope Francis. Again, this was their first face-to-face at the Vatican, what they reportedly discussed and what they exchanged, and what that might mean. Plus, Trump is in Belgium for his first NATO summit. That will happen tomorrow. What's likely to be on the agenda during that summit? We'll take a look at the president's involvement on NATO, what he used to say, what he's saying now. Basically, you say it was not obsolete, but he's not saying that anymore. What changed his mind? All right, let's get to our big story, though, today. And that is, of course, the CBO report that came out just minutes ago. It estimates that the American Health Care Act will reduce the federal deficit by $119 billion over the next decade. That's about $32 billion less than the original health care bill, but the bill will also increase the number of uninsured people by 23 million in 2026, so big difference. However, the CBO report says that the number of people with health insurance would be slightly higher and premiums slightly lower than they would have been under the previous version of the bill. Now, earlier today, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell said Obamacare needs to go, despite whatever the CBO score had to say. Here's what he said.
This much is absolutely clear. The status quo under Obamacare is completely unacceptable and totally unsustainable.
Let's start with you, Chris. Do you agree with what the senator had to say? Does it need to go no matter what?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. Look, the bottom line is, as someone who owns a small business, Obamacare has essentially come close to putting us out of business, number one. Mm-hmm. Number two, in terms of what it's supposed to offer, you have a number of companies, insurers, who are pulling out of Obamacare. Obamacare just doesn't work. You have too many subsidies, you have too many exceptions, so I think it absolutely needs to go.
Grover, how encouraging is this new CBO score? I know the House passed this latest bill without waiting for that score to come in. Will this be helpful to them?
Absolutely, because what it means is it's bird compliant, that you can enact it through the House and the Senate with a simple majority. You don't need 60 votes in the Senate, and that the tax cuts, this is a $1 trillion tax cut over a decade, and the spending cuts, this is more than $1 trillion in spending reduction, are both permanent, not temporary, like the Bush tax cuts were only good for 10 years, but permanent. So that's the only number that matters. The CBO guessing how many people, quote unquote, lose their health insurance, they are going from estimates that the CBO made they were off by 100% on how many people would get health care. And they're counting the numbers who lose health care from numbers that don't exist. I mean, they're really working off of their own previous lousy numbers, which they haven't fixed. They said there'd be twice as many people in the exchanges as there are now. And then they say a bunch of people, if you don't force them to buy health insurance through the exchanges with Obama's rules, if you don't force them to, then they've lost their insurance. That's not losing, that's escaping. It's really dishonest.
Yeah, I see you nodding your head there, Chris. You're in agreement there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, look, from the standpoint of Obamacare and what it did, essentially it hijacked a lot of people into the population. They also had a spin which made people think that they were absolutely getting coverage when in fact they were not. The whole exchanges thing was an absolute scam. And I think Grover is absolutely correct in terms of these numbers. To quote a former president, it is in fact fuzzy math that they're using in this particular case.
So are you encouraged by this new CBO report?
Yeah, and I think as Grover said, it's, we know what the number is that matters. This whole conversation about who's going to be in, who's going to be out, they have absolutely no way of knowing.
But that was damaging during the first round when they were trying to pass this bill. Also not talking to other people was damaging as well.
Yeah, I mean, it was damaging, but, it's Washington. And so
That's true. That's true. Enough said. All right. So I want to make sure that we get a chance to talk about the president's budget proposal, because, Grover, I'm sure you have a lot to say about that. As you know, he sent Congress his $4 trillion spending plan. It relies on quick economic growth and steep cuts to low-income programs. The proposal projects that this year's deficit, everyone hold on, everyone's sitting down. I can barely spit this out. $603 billion. Just in case you're wondering, that's an $18 billion increase just from last year. But some are saying if Trump's initiatives are actually adopted, that the deficit will decline and actually reach a small surplus, again, keyword, of $16 billion, but by 2027. As I'm sure both of you would probably expect, several Democrats slammed the proposal, and that includes, of course, Hillary Clinton. She criticized the budget as, quote, an unimaginable level of cruelty. Democratic lawmakers also grilled Education Secretary Betsy DeVos on the budget today.
For the life of me, I got to understand what your thinking is about this budget and low-income students, vulnerable students, minority students, students who really deserve a shot at a good quality public education.
In April. That was just a few weeks ago.
So you're not eliminating it, or you are eliminating it?
No.
You're not?
The figures in the budget that we're working from were all put together prior to the omnibus legislation.
Okay, so you're going to restore the $7.5 million in the strengthening master's degree program?
Well, I think that is going to be up to Congress to decide how to handle that anomaly.
Grover, just your overall reaction. You kind of had to feel for Betsy a little bit. She did have a difficult time during her confirmation hearing. Did she redeem herself in any way today? And just overall, what do you think about the president's budget proposal?
The president's budget proposal is fine. It reduces a lot of spending areas. It takes care of some of the rebuilding of national defense that's necessary. It says if you cut taxes and you get rid of Obamacare and you do the deregulation that Trump is actually doing, not talking about, but doing, that will grow at least 3% a year. The Democrat position is that 2%, which is what Obama delivered over the last 8 years, is as good as anybody could ever do. That's what they said at the end of the failed Carter administration. Limits to growth, the Club of Rome. All of the smart, beautiful cognoscenti knew that growth was no longer possible until Reagan cut taxes, very similar tax cut to Trump's tax cut, and we grew at 4% a year for the next 8 years. We're only talking in this situation, assuming 3% growth. I believe if we pass the Trump tax cut, that you'll be looking at 4% growth because the rates are so dramatically down. It's so pro-growth. and add to that the deregulatory pro-permit positions that this administration has taken. We're going to build pipelines instead of pay bureaucrats to kill them. We've ending a 8-year war against infrastructure in this country, against building roads, against building bridges, against building power plants, against building pipelines. And now we're going to allow that to happen and indeed encourage it. That's millions of jobs. 3% is a modest expectation for growth.
Grover, I know we need to let you go. I was hoping to ask you about a tweet that you sent out targeting the IRS, but we may have to do it another time because I promised. Oh, wait, they brought it up. Okay, do you have time to talk about that tweet?
Sure.
Okay, you think that Trump should fire the head of the IRS. Why do you think that?
Well, this is the fellow who has not fired people who are responsible for politically targeting Tea Party activists, conservative, center-right people trying to set up C3s and C4s. We know that this happened. We know that the people who did it destroyed documents that ought to be looked at, that ought to be public, and why they were targeting conservatives. This is political bias on the part of the IRS. The present, the chairman of the IRS, head of the IRS, is not going after those crimes. This is not legal to do in the United States of America, and instead has been part of the cover-up. He should have been fired on day one if we had a replacement. I realize Trump has many, many things to do. On the to-do list, I would suggest firing the head of the IRS sooner rather than later.
All right, Grover Norquist, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Would you like to respond to that, Chris?
I've said, the head of the IRS should have been gone a very long time ago, because the issue of targeting groups, conservative groups, Tea Party groups, that is clearly illegal, and it has gone on unabated and without punishment. So I absolutely agree with that.
Well, maybe the president is listening right now and talking about that. We only have a few seconds left, and we don't have time to go into everything when it comes to the budget. Obviously, Medicaid is big on the chopping block. Food stamps, we talked about Betsy DeVos. Huge cuts to federal money for student loans. Anything in there that you would side with, and even some Republicans have said that they don't agree with some of these proposals. Anything in there that you would take away from the president's proposal, or that you also agree with the president?
Well, I think, and again, I think this is a proposal that was made by the president. Congress will absolutely decide. I think on the education front, though, we really do have to get that together. I think we have to really, because it's very, very important that we have education and an educational system that works. So I would look more closely at ensuring that the education budget is in line with what our needs are.
All right, they're talking about allocating more money towards student choice, school choice, I should say.
Yes.
So we'll talk more about this, I'm sure, in the coming days. Chris, we're going to ask you to stick around. We still have a lot more to talk about. But right now, we want to hear from you. We're asking the question again, do you think President Trump's campaign colluded with the Russians, or do you think this is just a witch hunt, as the president and some of his supporters have suggested? I got a lot of response to this question yesterday, so that's why we're continuing to ask this today. Send us your thoughts, or you can email us at NewsmaxNow, or at NewsmaxNow, or at NewsmaxTV.com. We'll share some of those a little bit later.